IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with Kol Israel. Welcome again to the Roundtable of ICT, the Institute for Counter-Terrorism at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. We designate this roundtable today for a special occasion, and the occasion is the 11th International Conference that we are holding next week at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Of course, we are marking on that specific event the atrocity of, or the decade for the atrocity of the 9/11 attacks, and we are conducting this conference in the midst of very interesting processes which we are witnessing in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, and the international community altogether. And I refer especially to three events which the conference will focus on. The first issue that we will discuss during the conference and during this roundtable today would be the retrospective point of view of what was accomplished, what we didn't manage to accomplish in the international arena 10 years after 9/11 in the counterterrorism policy of the international community of United States, of Israel and other countries altogether. Where are we standing today? What are we facing today? What's the nature of the global jihadi terrorist phenomenon, Al-Qaeda, and so on and so forth. The second subject matter that we intend to discuss today in the conference will be the Arab Spring, and I would say more than that, the ramifications of the Arab Spring on the Middle East, on the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the international community altogether. Of course, the ramification of that process on Israel and the relations between Israel and our neighbors. And last but not least, we are going to witness an interesting, to say the least, an interesting event which is going to be conducted in a few weeks from now. And this is probably the declaration of a Palestinian state in the UN. This declaration might or might not influence the Israeli-Palestinian relations, the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and again the whole region in the Middle Eastern affairs, and we will discuss this matter as well. I'm privileged today to have with me three of my good friends, my colleagues, esteemed colleagues I have to say, and people that has a lot of experience and knowledge in those subject matters, and we are going to conduct the discussion with you. I would like to present my three colleagues, and I would start with Dr. Eli Karmon. Eli Karmon is a senior researcher at the ICT, the Institute for Counter-Terrorism. I would not dare even to try to elaborate on all the bio and CV of you and my other colleagues, because it probably will take the whole program that we have today. But I will mention a few points, the fact that you are being associate fellow, visiting fellow, member of advisory board of many institutes around the world, a member of the Atlantic Forum and involved in the NATO activity as a consultant, and of course writing extensively on those subject matters. In the conference, you, if I'm not mistaken, you are participating and leading two sessions, and one of them is the Arab Spring, or the revolutions in the Arab world from the point of view of Iran and Al-Qaeda, and the international influences on the Palestinian arena. So welcome.
Thank you.
And we have with us also Dr. Amichai Magen. Amichai Magen is also a senior researcher at the ICT, the head of the Political Development and Counterterrorism Desk. Amichai came to us from Stanford. He's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was teaching as a lecturer in the law school at Stanford. Amichai gained many awards. I will not mention all of them. Wrote a lot of articles and books on many subject matters, and some of them are very interesting for us. You are actually leading the workshop on the Middle East between democracy and state failure. Welcome.
Good to be here, Boaz. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. And last but not least, my friend and colleague, Dr. Assaf Moghadam. Assaf is a newcomer to the IDC. It's not a newcomer already. I mean, it's almost more than a year or something like that. We are very privileged to have Assaf at ICT and the Interdisciplinary Center. Assaf is also a senior researcher at the ICT. He was an assistant professor at the West Point, a senior associate of the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point, and writing extensively on those subject matters. He participates also in two workshops at the conference next week. One of them is the same conference of the revolutions in the Arab world from the point of view of Iran and Al-Qaeda. And the other one is the evolution of the global jihadi phenomenon after the death of bin Laden. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So now we can just start to discuss those subject matters. And I would like to start with the perspectives on terrorism, global jihadi terrorism, the threat that the international community is facing today, with a special point of view on the ramifications of the death of bin Laden. I would start by asking you, Assaf, what is really your take on where Al-Qaeda in particular is standing today after the killing of bin Laden? What is the magnitude of the threat of global jihadi terrorism in general and Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks in particular?
I think that the killing of Osama bin Laden has had a major impact on the group, but I think that we also should not look at the killing of Osama bin Laden alone, but we have to look at it also in a larger context, including actually also the Arab Spring. But let me start with bin Laden, because I think that his killing has been very, very significant. Bin Laden was the commander-in-chief of bin Laden. I'm sorry, of Al-Qaeda, yeah. And he actually had a lot more operational say than many of us had expected. I think that his killing is a huge.
This is something that I think we learned from the documents that were yes. captured in his. We were caught by surprise in a way, yes. in the level of operational involvement of
absolutely.
Bin Laden.
Yeah, I think he has been much more involved than many of us had believed. But I think despite his involvement, Al-Qaeda has significantly weakened in the course of the decade after 9/11, and I think that the recent and I think that the death of bin Laden and the subsequent capturing of all the intelligence documents are only going to enhance the further weakening of Al-Qaeda. I think in terms of Al-Qaeda and how it has evolved in the last decade, I think that Al-Qaeda is, despite its weakening, still dangerous, but the nature of the threat that it poses today to the West and its allies, not only to the West but to Western allies, is a different one.
In what way?
I think that Al-Qaeda has evolved very significantly in the last 10 years in terms of its strategy, in terms of its ideology, and in terms of its structure. And the totality of these evolutions has posed a type of threat today that is broader. I think that today we are more likely to see a larger variety of different types of attacks. I think that we're probably going to see less spectacular type of attacks of the 9/11 type, because Al-Qaeda, I think, has been battered in that regard. American counterterrorism efforts have been successful, I think, in eroding Al-Qaeda's capabilities. But at the same time, I think that the jihadi movement, Al-Qaeda's ideology, Al-Qaeda has been successful in spreading its ideology to more distant places. And so here, I would just like to say a word about Al-Qaeda's evolution, sure. Because I think it really is important. In terms of its strategy, Al-Qaeda in the last decade has evolved in several ways. It has increased its media productions. It has also increasingly it has waged economic jihad. It is focused much more on attempting to really undermine Western economic prowess. In terms of ideology, I think a very significant evolution in the last 10 years has been a dilution of Al-Qaeda's ideology. Al-Qaeda used to, 10 years ago, be much more stringent, much more doctrinal in its Salafi jihadist ideology. But over time, in the last 10 decades, al-Qaeda's ideology has really widened. It has become more diluted. It has accepted more people. It has even appealed to non-Muslims. It has recently appealed to environmentalists. It has blamed America for global warming. And these are different sort of messages than simply appealing to Muslims and saying you have to fight for, And finally, in terms of its structure, I think al-Qaeda collaborates much more today than 10 years ago with local affiliates, with groups that are geographically co-located, groups like the Haqqani Network or the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, and that again has an effect on the type of threat that al-Qaeda poses today. It's a more diverse threat. It emanates from a larger number of affiliates and associates.
Thank you. Taking this statement that you had actually leads me to classify between different threats that are connected to this phenomenon of global jihadi terrorism and al-Qaeda itself. And if I would need to refer to that, I would suggest to differ between three circles of threats. The core al-Qaeda, the nucleus group of al-Qaeda, it used to be bin Laden, now it's Zawahiri leading that core group. The affiliates of al-Qaeda, the local jihadists which are affiliated in that or the other way to the core group of al-Qaeda, and people, groups, and networks that have been inspired by al-Qaeda, and those are the homegrown terrorists in the Western society and so on and so forth. And I would like to ask you, Eli, in reference to those three groups, or maybe you have another classification in mind, how would you differ between the threats that those elements are posing to the safety of the world today?
I think that you really categorized very well these three kind of networks, I would say, beside the core of al-Qaeda. But I would like to refer, first of all, to the fact that just 10 years after 9/11, I think al-Qaeda core group is practically demised. And at the same time, on the political level, the Arab uprisings or popular uprisings, I don't like the term Arab Spring or Arab revolutions. I think it's still uprisings, and we don't know exactly in what direction they will go. But they showed that the violence and terrorism of al-Qaeda are counterproductive, and the real results are really brought by popular uprisings after a long period of stagnation in the Arab world. I think that the main victory of, or the main success of al-Qaeda was, first of all, the 9/11 attack as a watershed, from which terrorism became a real strategic threat to all of the world, recognized also as such. It was also before that, but recognized as an important strategic threat. And the second is it produced or exacerbated the conflict between the United States and the West and the Muslim world. We must recognize that this was one, I don't know if it was intended, but this was one of the results. Now, the Arab uprisings, they can lead perhaps to a better Arab world, democratic Arab world. But meantime, we can also see that al-Qaeda, and especially those local groups or those associates, can strengthen themselves in some regions which are now practically destabilized or not under control of the central government. And I speak about Yemen, I speak about Sinai, and even Egypt perhaps, and North Africa, especially Libya. So we can see perhaps a kind of paradox. On the one hand, the success of the political uprisings, but at the same time a threat of growing terrorism in these destabilized regions, at least for the near future.
So you see the outcome of the what is being called the Arab Spring or the Arab uprising, as you refer to them, as a force multiplier or a possible force multiplier to this phenomenon of local and global jihadi terrorism.
Not intended. Not intended by those which provoked the revolutions or were behind the revolutions, but because we see that this situation brings a lot of socio-economic and political instability, and we don't know how much time it will take to these countries, especially to Egypt, to Tunisia. Libya perhaps is easier because it's a richer country, but Egypt and Tunisia, and even perhaps Jordan in the future, and clearly Yemen.
Thank you. We'll have a short musical break, and then we'll explore that furthermore with you, Amichai. Thank you.
IDC Radio.
Eli Karmon was mentioning the problem of ungoverned territories and failed statehood, and this is actually one of your major fields. What is your take on the threat of this failed statehood as an outcome of the Arab Spring, and what is the ramification of that on the stability of the region and terrorism as a whole?
Well, I think Eli raised a very astute point that we really have to make a distinction, a conceptual distinction between tactical victory and strategic retreat. I think that on the tactical level, there is no doubt, certainly, that over the last decade, the Western world has become more aware. It has improved its ability to target terrorists, and it has improved its ability to collect intelligence on the ground. All these major faults that were identified in the 9/11 report almost a decade ago, many of them, I think we've made some substantial improvements on. And that's on the tactical level, and the killing of bin Laden was certainly an important watermark in this regard. On the other hand, when we look at the international system today, when we look at what we used to call the liberal international order, that was really based on the notion of effective sovereign states cooperating with one another through a network of international organizations that was built on principles of democracy, of free trade, and so on and so forth, under American leadership. There is no doubt that we have seen that system take some severe knocks over the last decades in a way that inadvertently, as Eli has mentioned, has really empowered various new ideological and theological competitors to the West, to democracy, and to capitalism. Now, we in Israel always like to think that we experience things first, and then it's Europe and the United States that experiences them later. In this sense, I think the pattern has been reversed. If we look at the national security strategy of the United States immediately after 9/11, we see a massive conceptual shift in American strategic thinking, and we see that there's an American awareness that in today's world, the United States is threatened just as much by failed states as it is by powerful ones. And I think that, unfortunately, we in Israel have not yet internalized that lesson as deeply, and we will have to contend over the coming months and years with a strategic reality that shows a worrying tendency towards state failure in North Africa and the Middle East.
Yes. Actually, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us, because in the modern history, we saw time and again that terrorist organizations are deploying and are being rooted in those ungoverned territories, in territories of failed states, and so on and so forth. We saw it in Lebanon. We see it today in Gaza. We saw it in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in other places altogether, which leads me actually to ask you, Assaf, what do you think will be the ramifications of some states falling into this condition of failed statehood as an outcome of the Arab Spring? And I refer mainly to Libya, for that matter. Yemen was even prior to this Arab Spring process, but maybe it's now becoming a bigger problem. Mm-hmm. And Sinai, for example, how would this might be used or being used mm-hmm. by the global jihadists, by Al-Qaeda? So
I think absolutely. I think that failed states, weak states, they are places where terrorists really thrive. And it doesn't just happen by happenstance. It's not just happenstance, but it's actually a deliberate strategy of terrorist organizations to seek out these failed states, to insert themselves into these territories, to increase the chaos in these places, and then to present themselves actually as those elements that can bring stability. I mean, we've seen examples like the Taliban, for example. When it entered Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal, it presented itself as as an element that created order. Al-Qaeda, for example, there are Al-Qaeda strategists, Abu Bakr Naji is one example, who have written about Al-Qaeda and how it has to actually insert itself into these weak states, increase chaos, and then present itself as the big savior. And I think that this is one of the dangers of the Arab Spring. As far as the Arab Spring's implication for Al-Qaeda is concerned, I think that there are two competing narratives. There is, from our Western perspective, an optimistic narrative, which goes more or less like, the Arab Spring has shown that nonviolence is the real method by which regime change has taken place, and this is kind of a blow to Al-Qaeda. In other words, what Al-Qaeda has failed to achieve through violence in 2 decades, a bunch of demonstrators have managed to achieve in a few weeks, and that's the optimistic narrative. Mm-hmm. The pessimistic narrative is that the Arab Spring is going to fail to bring about stability, and that will exactly give rise to groups like Al-Qaeda. I personally, I'm more skeptical about the outcome of the Arab Spring. I don't think that it's going to create perfect democracies. But I think more importantly, I doubt that we will see stability happen very fast. And so I'm rather pessimistic on this.
Going back to you, Amichai, what we see here probably, this Arab Spring, if it's not a direct outcome, it's definitely being fueled by the American perception, I would say the American cultural perception, which is bipartisan perception, Democrats and Republicans all together, seeing democracy as a miracle solution to every problem in the world today. And taking that sometimes into a simplistic approach in believing that free election is by itself is already promoting peace and stability and so on and so forth. Although we saw even in the recent history cases in which free elections led to the fact that very fundamentalist elements won the elections, like Hamas in Gaza, like Khomeini in Iran, and so on and so forth. So how do you see that process coming through in the Arab world today, in the Arab Spring today? And since we have some kind of a gloomy discussion here between different types of pessimists in a way, maybe you can lead us the way of how can, if possible at all, how can we track that into a positive track?
Well, let me be a little bit more optimistic or offer you the silver lining of the clouds that are gathering here in the room and relate to the 2 points that you raise. One is, I think that there is a growing understanding in the United States today that democracy and electoralism are not one and the same. There is a growing understanding in the policy community, in the academic community, that elections in themselves do not a democracy make, that even in consolidated liberal democracies, elections are naturally polarizing events that produce societal conflicts, and that in many respects, free and fair elections, while they are absolutely indispensable to the existence of democracy, should come at the end of, or towards the end of, a gradual process of, first and foremost, effective state building, because you cannot have a democratic state if you do not have a functioning state, and that we should think about democratic development as an open-ended, long-term process that puts an emphasis on the rule of law, that puts an emphasis on individual and minority rights, and so on and so forth. I do believe that there is growing understanding of that need. On the other hand, I think the ability of the United States today, and indeed also of the European Union following the financial crisis and so on and so forth, to actually influence positive democratic development in the Middle East has diminished. But that's a gloomy subject, and that's something that we're certainly going to be discussing the ramifications of at the conference itself. In terms of what is happening in the region, again, if we adopt a longer-term historical perspective, we could view what is happening in the region as rather less gloomy than what we've drawn out here. Let's first of all remember that democratization, even in the West, was a long-term process, many times decades long and centuries long. It was accompanied by violence. It was accompanied by revolution and upheaval.
They're not gloomy.
No. So we have to be realistic about processes of democratization. The good news is that if we look at the world in 1974, there were 39 democracies on the planet, and they were all concentrated in Western Europe, North America, and certain former colonies of the British Empire. Israel, by the way, is one of the oldest liberal democracies in the world. Over the last generation or two, we have seen a global democratic revolution that has taken electoral democracy to all parts of the world. Who would have thought 30 years ago that other than Cuba and Venezuela, all of Latin America would be composed of consolidated liberal democracies? One understanding of what is happening in the region is that finally, the only region in the world that seemed to have been completely impervious to this global democratic revolution, i.e. the Middle East, is finally becoming receptive through processes of diffusion, through processes of modernization, and that there is a cadre of especially young people across the Middle East that want a better life, that want a better future. That is something that I believe as Israelis we should support, is something that we should be open to and we should encourage, but at the same time we cannot ignore the rather less optimistic processes that are happening, the proliferation of state failure and the rising power of armed non-state actors that are hijacking, with the assistance of anti-Western states such as Iran and Syria, those weakly governed states. We have a real competition. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, we have a real competition on our hand between capitalist liberal democracies on the one hand and a new form of authoritarianism on the other. It seems to me that the West needs to wake up to that reality.
I hate to break this interesting discussion right now, but we need to have another musical interlude. I promise to take it exactly from that point after the musical break. Thank you.
IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio in collaboration with Kol Israel.
Welcome back to the Roundtable of ICT, which we designate that to the international conference that ICT is holding next week at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. We have conducted an interesting discussion on the ramifications of the Arab Spring in the region, and I would like now to ask you, Eli, trying to zoom in on one state that have witnessed this process of revolution or uprising, as you refer to it, and I refer to Egypt. Egypt is a very interesting state and very relevant to Israel. What is your perspective on the process that Egypt is facing today, and what do you think will be the influence of that process on the Israeli-Egyptian relations? And if you can also zoom in on this fragile subject of Sinai and the fact that Sinai is not very well controlled, and what the threat that this is posing to Israel.
With your permission, one comment about what was spoken before about the global threat of terrorism. We must not exaggerate the threat of terrorism in the weakness of the United States and Europe. There are three issues, I think, that influence very much the present weakness of the West. It is the war in Iraq, not the war itself, which was a great military success, but the management after war by the American Bush administration of the peace in Iraq, the financial crisis, which is not so much the result of the war on terror, but internal problems in the United States and now in Europe, and the growth of China as a power which is seen by many other countries, including the Muslim countries, as a balance to the influence of the United States and the West. This said, I think that we can say even that perhaps the occupation, the liberalization and democratization of Iraq has influenced the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring. Again, I don't like the Arab Spring expression. Egypt is a very important country, not only in the Arab world. It is the most important Arab country, the biggest one, with a very long history and cultural and political influence. But at the same time, it is one of the pillars of the non-allied movement in the past and has a lot of influence in the Muslim world and so on. What happened there, it was, I think, expected in the sense that this was a regime which was at its end, and we know that all the socioeconomic problems were very difficult in Egypt. So the problem is that it was relatively non-violent transition from the Mubarak regime to something which is now a hybrid regime of military junta together with elements which are not clearly liberal, but more, I would say, nationalists and Islamic movements. Muslim Brotherhood, first of all, but also we see a revival of the Salafist movements. And if we see the trends inside Egypt during the last months, there is a kind of alliance, if I would say, between the junta or the military, the Muslim Brotherhood, and what perhaps nationalist or Nasserist, which permitted the success at the referendum, has strengthened the Muslim Brotherhood. And if in the elections, next elections for the parliament, the Muslim Brotherhood will take the lead, will have a huge problem, first of all, in my opinion, for Egypt itself, but also for the relations with Israel and other countries also, which, by the way, is a process which is similar in Syria, although there it is a very violent transition.
But I want to still focus on Egypt, with your permission. What would be the ramification of what you're describing right now to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and the stability and the security of Israel?
Already we see that there is a trend, especially, as I said, the Muslim, Islamist and nationalist parties and groups, to try to change the peace agreement with Israel, at least to change, or even there are voices to try to cancel it completely. The last event, the terrorist attack from Sinai to Israel, has provoked a reaction, very anti-Israeli reaction, although it was clear that this was the fault of the Egyptian authorities, which do not control Sinai. And coming to Sinai, this process began already in 2004, 2005, when Al-Qaeda from Saudi Arabia and from Iraq tried to penetrate Egypt through Sinai. We remember the big attacks in 2004, 2005 against the tourist hubs, and even in Cairo. The Mubarak regime controlled, after a long fight with the Bedouin tribes and the Islamist part of the territory, but it still remained relatively uncontrolled territory, which permitted the smuggling, huge amount of smuggling, through the Sinai to the Gaza Strip, but also to elements, Islamist elements in Egypt. So what we see since the uprisings and the lack of control by the security and police services, which practically disappeared from the area, and even in Cairo, you know that they are very acting with difficulty. We see that these elements had tried to take control of Sinai. They attacked, even enforced police stations. It's not a terrorist attack, it's a guerrilla attack, 200 people together.
With your permission, I would like to ask you, Assaf, on that point. How does Al-Qaeda in the global jihadist refers altogether to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and do they find this as an advantage that Sinai is becoming an ungoverned territory, and do they try to exploit this advantage?
Let me first say a couple of things about Al-Qaeda and Israel. You know, Al-Qaeda's enemies are mainly composed of three elements. One of them is the Zionists, which is shorthand for Israel, but also the Jews in general. The second is the Crusaders, which is basically the Western Christian states led by the United States. And the third element for Al-Qaeda's enemies are the apostates, the local nominally Muslim regimes who are not Muslim enough, and so they're being attacked. I think that Israel, or the Jews in that regard, they assume a little bit of a special place in that kind of a triangle of enemies. And that's because if you really look at Al-Qaeda statements, Israel, or Zionists, as Al-Qaeda calls Israel and the Jews, is really the only one of these three elements which has never been offered any way out of escaping kind of Al-Qaeda's list of enemies. The Americans have been offered a way to stop their occupation. They can go back to America and they will stop being Al-Qaeda's enemies. The apostates, they can convert and they can adopt the jihadi ideology and they can stop being the enemies. But the Jews, the Zionists have never been offered a way out. So in some ways, at least in some respects, the Zionists, Jews, I'm using of course Al-Qaeda's term, are perhaps the most hated enemy of these. Now, Al-Qaeda has always cared about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It has stepped up kind of its condemnations of Israeli policies as it has become more and more under attack. So Al-Qaeda is a very, very keen political, strategic player. The more Al-Qaeda has been under pressure, the more it has referred to alleged Israeli atrocities.
But here there is a question I want to pose to you. Reading speeches of the decision makers in the United States, I refer to Daniel Benjamin, the coordinator of Counter-Terrorism, John Brennan, the advisor for Counter-Terrorism of the White House, and so on and so forth. They actually say it. It's not even trying to hide it between the lines. They are saying that it should be an important task of the United States to solve regional problems, because they don't use the term root causes, but they imply as if this is a root cause of the radicalization process in the Muslim world and the support that Al-Qaeda gains. I personally tend to believe that they are mixing between root causes and instrumental causes, because the root causes, in my view, for the giving birth of the phenomenon of Al-Qaeda and the support that Al-Qaeda gets all over the world, and the radicalization process is an outcome of an extreme Islamic radical ideology, violent ideology that Al-Qaeda is trying to offer to the Muslim masses all over the world. That's the root cause, and they are misusing regional conflicts as instrumental causes in order to gain the support of many Muslims. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, is one of those pillars of these instrumental causes. That's something that I think needed to be discussed, because not just the American people tend to believe that if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be solved, maybe we would see the end of this radicalization process in the world. And not that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict shouldn't be solved. It should be solved, of course.
No, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think that obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is exploited by many actors in the region for their own political ends. It is exploited, I think, by local regimes here in the Middle East to deflect attention from their own problems. And so oftentimes they will go to Washington, and what they did for decades is they hyped a situation that I believe, don't really care about so much, but it serves their political causes. Now, as far as the American administration is concerned, I think that it regards the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict helpful, but I think that anybody who knows a little bit about the Middle East understands that this is probably not that all the problems of the Middle East would not be solved if only the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be solved. I think that Washington analysts are smarter than that, but Americans have many interests, and they have to bring a lot of different parties with different interests and their own interests under one roof, and so I think we have to look at it under this light.
Thank you, Assaf. We will have another musical break, and then we will discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the face of the declaration of a Palestinian state in the UN.
IDC Radio.
Here we are again in the roundtable of ICT, and time is running out. We still have a lot of subject matters that we plan to discuss. The Turkish actor in those processes of the Arab Spring and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what happened today in Syria, in the uprising in Syria, Iranian involvement and Hezbollah involvement. Well, probably we would need another roundtable for all of those subject matters, but Just in order to close this session, I would like to focus on a process which is happening very shortly and probably going to be a declaration of a Palestinian state at the UN Assembly, and the ramifications of those declarations. I would like to ask you, Amichai, how do you believe this will influence the region as a whole, the Israeli-Palestinian relations, the different actors in the region, Hamas, Abu Mazen, and what is your take on that?
Well, my sense is that there's a great sense of impatience and loss of confidence in the existing diplomatic paradigm, which is mainly felt around the world. I think we'll see it manifested very clearly at the UN General Assembly soon, where a very large number of countries will vote to support the notion of the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, simply because they're saying to the Israelis and the Palestinians, a plague on both your houses. We want this issue off the agenda of the international community. Let's be done with this. Now, we might think that this is a short-sighted approach, one that could actually lead to greater instability rather than to a real breakthrough in the peace process. But it seems to me that at least in the short run, that is the reaction of the world and the Palestinian leadership. And here I'm talking about Fatah and Abu Mazen, who also wants to mark his place in history. He's not getting any younger. Is something that they feel very strongly. Clearly, the Palestinians are trying to leverage this threat in order to either achieve membership at the UN, which I think they understand they will not get, because that is the purview of the UN Security Council, and that will be vetoed. But they're trying to break out of the diplomatic gridlock, and it seems to me that the diplomatic gridlock right now is playing into the hands of the radical elements in the Middle East. We've mentioned some of them, and is not helping us move in a constructive way forward.
Thank you. The same question I would like to pose to you, Eli, and to add to that, do you expect that there will be a breakdown in the security situation? Should we expect another intifada as an outcome of the declaration?
I think that the Palestinian Authority, at least, they are trying to organize a huge non-violent movement. But as we saw last summer, it is possible that this will have provocations, especially from Hamas and other Salafist groups, and also from Syria or even Hezbollah. And this can become a violent, not uprising, but a conflict which could degenerate in a real conflict with some of our neighbors. But I would like to say two more things. One, that after this declaration of the Palestinian state, the two sides will have to return to the negotiation table. And the problem is that there is no real agreement between Fatah and Hamas. Although they signed an agreement, nothing was implemented even now, 2 weeks before this declaration. Second, that Hamas does not accept the existence of Israel, does not want to renounce violence, so I don't see how they will continue to be partners in this process. And the second comment is that the recognition of Palestinian state will influence other ethnic groups, especially the Kurds in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, which will say, why not us? 35 million are not independent. The Baluchis in Pakistan and Iran, and even the Uyghurs in China, which will see the same methods, to try to use the same methods to achieve independence.
Thank you. Last question to you, Assaf. Eli was mentioning those party breakers, the Salafist groups in Gaza, and those that are inspired and affiliated with Al-Qaeda. What do you think will be their reaction to this process of the declaration of a state, of a Palestinian state, and how do you see the relations or connections between Hamas and those Salafist elements there?
I still think that there has been in recent years somewhat of an increase in the activity of Salafi actors, but at least in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas has a very, very clear hold, these Salafi actors have still not been able to find the space because Hamas simply won't let them. And so I think that this is actually the real issue, is that even if they want to rear their heads, Hamas is keeping them under tabs.
Yes. I would like to conclude here and to say that we are living under the constant Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Yeah, we have interesting times here. You can learn about those interesting times from the short discussion that we have conducted, and I would like to thank each one of you, Eli, Amichai, and Assaf, for sharing your views with me and with the viewers and the listeners. It was fascinating for me, and I think it's a great teaser that give me the opportunity to invite everybody to the international conference that we're holding on the 11th of September and until the 14th of September. Those subject matters will be discussed in depth and other matters as well. We have more than 25 workshops on different variety of subject that has to deal with the Middle East, with the Arab Spring, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on and so forth. I would like to thank you for listening to the IDC Radio 106.2 FM, and I would like to give a special thank to the producer of this roundtable, Hila Oved, to the technician, Maggie Baruch, and to the video staff, Chagai Ognistov, Sasha Mityakov, and Lior Peleg. Thank you very much for listening to us, viewing us, and we hope to see you at the conference. Last word, those who will not be able to come, I urge you to hook to the ICT website, and you can see a live coverage of the conference during the days of the conference. It's ict.org.il. Thank you very much again. Looking forward to see you at the conference.
Thank you.
IDC Radio 106.2 FM. IDC Radio in collaboration with Kol Israel.
106.2 FM